This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Dahlia Shenlin speaking to you today from New York.
And I'm Gilad Halper in our studio in Tel Aviv.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we find fascinating. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we're counting on you.
Our guest today is Professor Daniella Talmon-Heller of the Department of Middle East Studies at Gurion University, who specializes in medieval Islamic history. This is also the subject of her latest book, entitled Sacred Place and Sacred Time in the Medieval Islamic Middle East, a Historical Perspective, that was published last year by Edinburgh University Press. Daniella Talmon-Heller, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
So before we delve into the specific case studies that you analyze in your book, can you explain, maybe briefly or generally, the link between religious ritual and place and time on a theoretical level?
So no religion or no institutional religion can hold rituals without a place and a time, right? That's pretty obvious. The interesting question is how each religious tradition perceives of the sacred and what practices it has developed in order to designate and play out the sacrality of places, of times, and also of objects.
And where does Islam come in as opposed to other monotheistic religions, namely Christianity and Judaism, but not only? What are the specifics of Islam in this case?
I'm not sure Islam has a distinct perception of sacred, which is totally different from other monotheistic religions. But I was interested to find out how Muslim tradition and Muslim society plays out the sanctity of its times and places, besides the very well-known canonical Orthodox cases of Mecca, the Kaaba, which is the site of the annual pilgrimage, an annual pilgrimage, which is incumbent on every Muslim man and woman once a lifetime, and of the month of Ramadan, which we have just entered now. Right? So those are well-known cases. Those are the sacred time and sacred place of Islam, and much of Islamic ritual is centered around those two. But throughout history, Muslims have developed additional, perhaps we can call them secondary, sacred times or privileged times and privileged places in which they held rituals. And looking at those cases, one can see the development, the dynamics of both Islamic thought and practice.
Can I ask you about the overlap between a book that is very, in my mind, in a fascinating way, focused on comparative religious, literature and theory to understand the theological dimensions of this, but you also emphasize that it's a historical perspective. So what is the interaction between a historical perspective and a religious studies perspective of the ritual of place and time?
Right. This is a very good question. First of all, I must stress that I'm an historian. I'm not a theoretician. I'm not a religious studies person.
That's great. Actually, that's a compliment with an E to me, because I am a religious studies person and my deep background. So we can simply complement our perspectives.
Right, and I think they must be complemented. I find a theoretical discussion much less appealing, if you will excuse me, than a discussion that is grounded in place and time, in a specific historical background. And what I wanted to do in this book was to tell a story, actually to tell two stories, with a plot, with a chronology, and through those discuss perceptions and ideas and also theoretical attitude towards the study of religion and religious life. And as you may have noticed, religious practice has a large presence in this book. It is not only about ideas, it's about the way people actually lived out or practiced their religion, and the ways they found to express their religious feelings and their religious ideas, both individually and communally.
So let's focus on the first part of the book, which is the place part, and it focuses on the several burial sites of the severed head of Al-Hussein ibn Ali, the grandson of Prophet Muhammad, canonical figure in Islam.
Right.
And it's interesting because it's traveled quite a bit, the severed head of Hussein. Can you take us briefly through the story of that severed head and how it became, how the ritual aspect of pilgrimage, etc., manifested itself in relation to it?
Yes, I'll try. Mm-hmm. Okay, so first of all, I must say that there are more than one narrative, as expected, regarding the whereabouts of the head, its odyssey, and its final place of rest. So according to the mainstream Shia, I would say the largest Shi'i denomination today, the Imamiyya, the Shia of Iran and southern Lebanon and southern Iraq, Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, was martyred by the hands of the sixth caliph, Caliph Yazid, when he was on his way to demand what was rightfully his, the caliphate, or the spiritual and political leadership of the Muslim community. It was in the 680. The Umayyads stopped him and killed him. According to the Shi'i tradition, he went to his death with open eyes. Perhaps we can liken his martyrdom to that of Jesus or other figures who chose death in order to make a point, in order to seek justice and to inspire the Muslims in ages to come to seek justice and recompense. And so, according to the Shi'i narrative, the body was mutilated after Hussein was murdered, massacred, and his head was sent off to the caliph in Damascus in a victorious procession. And the body was buried at Karbala, which is until today the main site of a Shi'i pilgrimage. For Shi'is, as important perhaps as Mecca. According to the Imami Shi'is, actually, finally the head was rejoined with the body of Hussein and buried in Karbala. But other Shi'i traditions have the head either buried in Damascus, and there is a shrine in his honor in the communal mosque of Damascus, or traveled further until Ascalon. And this is actually where the story I am telling, the story of the Ismaili Shia, who believe that the head was hidden purposefully in the peripheral town of Ascalon and rediscovered in the late 11th century by a vizier, like the right hand of the Fatimid caliph. Now, the land of Israel, Palestine, was under Fatimid rule, as were Egypt and Syria at the time. And so the Imami Caliph rejoiced at this wondrous discovery, which had a political implication, or it was a political asset to him, having regarding himself, the whole actually Fatimid dynasty regarded itself as direct descendants of Al-Hussein. And so a shrine was built in Ascalon, and Ashkelon in Hebrew, right?
Yeah, which is today a town in southern Israel.
Right. Became a pilgrimage site, but only for a short time. Because some 60 years later, the Crusaders conquered the town of Ashkelon. It was actually the last town that the Fatimids held on to after the Crusader conquest of Palestine. And the retreating Fatimids took the head with them to be reburied yet again in Cairo. And until today, it's an important shrine depicted beautifully in Naguib Mahfouz's book, the trilogy about Cairo, as really an important site of visitation, both for Cairians and for people who come to Cairo from all over the Muslim world.
So just continuing the question about sacred space, would you consider the shrine a matter of worship of the space itself because it is a pilgrimage site and because it has become just an important hub for the practice and ritual of Islam, or is it something to do with the head itself? I mean, which has the greater focus? Is it the space of worship or the object of worship, or maybe you'll say those two are inseparable?
Well, they were separable because the head was taken away. And this brings me to say that the object is, of course, extremely important, the relic, right? In this case, the relic made the place sacred. But actually, its temporary presence is enough. It leaves an imprint, which continues to draw pilgrims, even if the relic itself has been taken to a different place. And that's why we find quite a number of shrines in honor of Hussein, places where the head has rested on its journey from Karbala in southern Iraq through northern Syria and all the way to Damascus, Ascalon, and Egypt. So any place that the relic has touched or a drop of its blood has remained had become sacred in the eyes of the worshippers.
What does it say about really the development of the practice of pilgrimage in Islam? I mean, we take it almost for granted that religious people make pilgrimage somewhere and somehow. But can you tell us about the genesis of this practice in relation to, leaving the Hajj to Mecca aside, but in relation to, maybe a less important commandment as Al-Hussein's severed head?
That's an important question, and it's very pertinent also today, right? There's a debate between academics or historians, and there's a debate between Muslims themselves, both regarding the legitimacy of pilgrimage and visitation of sites connected to relics or connected to the presence of saints of sorts. They may be prophets or Sufi figures or scholars who were extremely important and well-known, warriors, sometimes rulers, who were considered either immediately or with time as saintly figures. So the legitimacy is debated. And for those claiming that it is contrary to Islam, there's debate. How did it come to be? So some Muslim authorities blame the Shi'is for having spread this or for having invented this custom of the visitation of graves and the veneration of saints and relics, and having spread this into or having contaminated Sunni Islam with this practice. You implied earlier that pilgrimage is a universal practice, and most likely it is, even though pilgrimage to graves or to relics is not altogether universal. According to scholars of Christianity, for the first 3 centuries, Christians did not venerate dead saints or dead martyrs. This actually grew in the early 4th century and became so basic to Christianity. The veneration of the importance of relics, the veneration of relics, and pilgrimage to sacred. In Islam, the development may have been similar. This is actually the claim of a very important Islamic Muslim scholar of the 13th, early 14th century, known as Ibn Taymiyyah. And even people who are not very familiar with medieval Islam may have heard his name because he's an extremely influential figure in all fundamentalist Islamic movements from the late 17th century and until today. So Al-Qaeda and Daesh and all jihadist Muslims all look back and look up to Ibn Taymiyyah, who was a purist or fundamentalist. And he very much opposed pilgrimage to graves and the veneration of saints, obviously the veneration of sacred relics and objects. And he claims that during the first centuries of Islam, Muslims kept away from those practices. And then, unfortunately, in his eyes, they began imitating the Jews, the Christians, and the Shi'is. And this particular innovation became more and more widespread in Sunni Islam as well. And indeed, it is a widespread practice. It was a actually, perhaps one should say that it was a widespread practice. And today, most Islamist movements are making a great effort to wipe it away.
We've touched on something a few times here, but I want to just kind of focus on this specifically. Can you explain to what extent both the practice of pilgrimage and specifically the journey that you cover is integral to the emergence of different sects within Islam, Shia and Sunni? I mean, the shrine is in Cairo, and it's a largely Sunni-dominated society. And you've also mentioned that those jihadist groups that you're talking about, who are trying to do what you said in your words, sort of purify the religion from that kind of practice, are all Sunni movements. Can you explain some of the evolution of these different versions based on surrounding the journey that you've been covering in the book?
Well, I'd say that the veneration of saintly figures is pivotal to Shi'i Islam, and early, really. The Shi'i imams had been venerated as almost superhuman figures from quite early on. And ever since the Shi'is had some political power, and that happened in the 10th, 11th century, their shrines became sites of pilgrimage, and very venerated sites of pilgrimage. And this is a totally legitimate, not more than legitimate. It's an important practice in Shi'i Islam. The veneration of the imams, the visits to the graves of the imams, the visit to Karbala, of course, but also to other shrines connected with other members of the family of the imams, are devotions, central devotions in Shi'i Islam, and very much encouraged by the Shi'i scholars and spiritual leadership. In Sunni Islam, this is much more debated. The fierce opposition we see today in Islamist movements was not necessarily known in medieval Islam, except I've mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah, who was very vehement on this point. But most scholars, and I've worked on this quite a bit, actually did not oppose visits to graves, and participated themselves in such visitation, insisting that one should avoid forbidden practices, such as praying directly to the saint rather than to God, or facing the grave rather than facing the Kaaba, or crying and kissing and rolling in dirt and all sorts of extravagant, enthusiastic behaviors like that. Stressing, making the point that prayer and worship are due to God alone. but yet accepting the fact, and it is accepted not only grudgingly for the sake of commoners, but we can find it also in theological treatises, that some people are closer to God than others, and that they can and may intercede for people who are less privileged and less close to God. And therefore, coming nearer to those figures can be a way of coming nearer to God. Ibn Taymiyyah, if I may add another word, I think has a very appealing way of trying to convince commoners that this is a mistake, saying that if one wants to pray for something which is illegitimate, why should he think that the saint will intercede for him? And if he's praying for something that is legitimate, why does he need the saint? He can pray directly to God, and there is no reason to pray by a grave. Praying by a cross, says Ibn Taymiyyah, may have exactly the same result.
Interesting. So let's move to the time bit in your book that is dedicated to the month of Rajab, which is one of the 4 holy months in the Islamic calendar. Again, in relation to Ramadan, the much well-known and much more sacred month in the calendar. Why did you choose to focus on Rajab on the one hand and the severed head of Al-Hussein ibn Ali on the other? What do the two tell us about sacred time and sacred place in Islam, again, in relation to the older siblings, right? Mecca and Ramadan.
Right. And what do they tell us in conjunction? Which is, for me, the million-dollar question, whether the book has made a point, right, by bringing those two together rather than writing 2 separate monographs. But let me begin with a short explanation about Rajab. Rajab is the 7th month in the Hijri calendar, and according to commentators on the Quran, it was one of 4 sacred months mentioned in the sacred book, in the Quran itself, as sacred month, venerated before Islam, venerated by the Arabs in the era of the Jahiliyyah, in the era of ignorance. Now, as we know, Islam came as if to salvage the pagan Arabs from the ignorance of the pre-Islamic period and bring them to the true religion and the recognition and the veneration of God. And therefore, most of the Jahili, of the pre-Islamic practices, were said to be denounced. But not all of them, not all of them. And here we come again to a debated issue, right? And this is what I find interesting. This is why I chose to speak about this secondary shrine rather than of the Kaaba, and of the month of Rajab rather than of Ramadan, because they are debated, because there's a discussion and disagreement. And this makes it more interesting, right? And also reveals more of the way of thinking of Muslim scholars and of practices and the relation towards practices of the Muslim people. So from early on, there was a disagreement between Muslim scholars whether the sanctity of those 4 months continues into the Islamic period or should be abrogated by the very rise of Islam. So some, like Ibn Taymiyyah, right, claimed that the Muslims should forego any custom or any special customs that related to the 4 months, Rajab included, such as special pilgrimages, visitation of shrines, ritual slaughter, and a few others, and concentrate on Ramadan as their one sacred month of Islam. A month in which God is nearer than during any other time to humans, and therefore it is the privileged time, a time where one seeks the nearness, the benevolence, and the mercy of God. And by one of the means, of course, is fasting. Others thought that Rajab continues to hold a privileged, or should continue to hold a privileged position, and therefore the customs of the Jahiliyyah should be continued in a monotheistic garb, pretty much like the Hajj itself. The Hajj was a pre-Islamic practice, and through the Quran, the new story that the Quran tells about the Hajj, old practices became monotheistic practices, were tied to an ancient, sacred, monotheistic tradition without changing much in the things people actually do. So Rajab, for some of the Muslims, remained a time of special veneration. And there's a story here too, or actually I'm trying to tell a story because I'm trying to show that things develop with time, that no religion, Islam included, of course, needless to say, are static or frozen in time, even though sometimes we have this perception, right, that religion is something static. No, religion is dynamic. Religion changes, and ideas form and change and reform, and so do practices. And with the time, I found that the new ideas describe this privileged position of Rajab. Okay, so I'll detail a little bit. So we have, again, the idea that God is closer to humans during privileged times. Of course, it's an interesting question whether it's all God's choice, right? There's something inherent in sanctity, either of times or of places, or perhaps humans have their role to play. Humans, and I found it striking that several Muslim thinkers actually believe that man plays a role, that man enhances or even creates sanctity by his devotions. So the devotions that were typical of Rajab, it's hard to say how widespread they were, but I believe they were quite widespread, and they became more popular with the passing of time. And also there's more religious literature devoted to enumerating the practices that are recommended for this time. And they include fasting, and they include special prayers day and night, and they include a ritual slaughter, and the ritual slaughter for dividing the meat, right? Like the ritual slaughter of Eid al-Adha, dividing the meat to the poor and almsgiving. And travel to shrines. And here the time and the place come together, right? So what I was looking for was, or what I was trying to do was look at commonalities and differences between the way the religious imagine the sanctity of time and of place, to try and compare the terminology and the means by which people designate, as I said earlier, individually and communally, the privileged position of a certain territory or a certain span of time, right, in temporal and territorial definitions, and whether the two compete or complete each other. And I found, perhaps not surprisingly, that they complete each other, that when sacred time and privileged place, or sacred place and privileged time come together, undoubtedly the religious experience is enhanced.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because I think that there's an interesting observation about Islam in particular, because sacred time and sacred place are all forms of, group ritual practice that define the religious community and the people, whether it's a particular sect of Islam or all Muslims. But one of the interesting things in Islam today, at least, is that I think of time as a matter of sometimes maybe conjecture or even dispute. When you think about the determination of when Ramadan actually begins and ends, representing different communities in Islam. I don't know if that was the case in medieval times. You do point out at one point that time was strictly managed in Islam in terms of religious practice, maybe in medieval times. So I'm curious to what extent this time in Islam is a unifying factor, or has it become something that represents different communities?
The calendar is something that represents different communities, right? The debate about the beginning of Ramadan is not a matter of principle. It's a matter of whether one sights the moon or not, and it is seen at a different time in different places, and it's also dependent on how cloudy the sky is. And since Islam sticks to the old traditional way of figuring or announcing the newborn moon, right, by sighting rather than by calculation, of course the Muslims knew to calculate when the new moon will be born, when the month will begin. But the way to actually do it remained the traditional way. So if there's an uncertainty when Ramadan begins, it is due to this rather than to a different conception of when Ramadan should begin. So a calendar, a common calendar, undoubtedly is something that defines a community and separates one community, one religious community from another. And who should know this better than Jews, right? Our calendar is so important to Jewish life. Maybe it's the most important. If you need to explain Judaism on one foot, I think that the Jewish calendar should be mentioned early on.
Well, true, but that's part of my point because there is not as much dispute. There are some minor details, but there's no difference in how Jews around the world, I think, interpret the calendar of holidays.
Right,
and
but
there's another major difference. Oh, okay.
Excuse me, but it was a major dispute between Karaites and Rabbinites, and also there's Talmudic story about that. I'm sorry, I don't remember the names, but one rabbi made the other come to him with his money and food on Yom Kippur to show that he submits, right, to the agreed upon calendar of the hegemonic calendar. But coming back to Islam, or I was interfering you in another question.
No. I think that I was just saying there is some distinction between Judaism and Christianity and Islam on this issue. And I guess the one other point that stood out to me thinking about the question of sacral time that distinguishes Islam in my reading is that because of the unadjusted lunar calendar, the holidays themselves rotate to different parts of the year. And it was sort of a marginal question about whether this creates a different sense, a different seasonal feeling of these rituals within Islam relative to holidays in other religious cultures that have a fixed time of year. But it's a bit of a marginal point.
Undoubtedly. Mm-hmm. No, I actually think it's an important point. And it very much, and I think it explains the rise of so many, let's say, non-canonical or non-orthodox or local festivities in Islam. Because of the lack of connection of the two actually canonical festivals, the Eid al-Fitr following the fast of Ramadan and Eid al-Adha following the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, which, as you've said, rotate each with time, right? The lunar calendar is shorter than the solar calendar by 11 days and a half. And so every 3 years, actually the holiday begins a month earlier, and there is no connection between the celebration and nature. Neither the agricultural calendar nor the seasonal calendar. They're totally separate from the religious calendar. And this is hard. This is almost unthinkable for us Jews, right? Because Pesach and Shavuot and Sukkot are so tied to the seasons and to the agricultural cycle. And Muslims must have felt this as a kind of void also. And therefore, on the local level, almost every community had celebrated festivities that were tied to the solar calendar. And if we think of Palestine, the visitation or the pilgrimage to Nabi Musa and Nabi Rubin and dozens of other sites in mandatory Palestine and Ottoman Palestine were fixed in the solar calendar. Actually were sort of paired with the Christian holidays, especially the spring celebrations were tied to Easter. rather than followed according to the Hijri calendar. Rajab, on the other hand, of course, is tied to is Hijri. It's a Hijri month, and there is no connection between the practices and celebrations and perceptions of Rajab and the agricultural or seasonal calendar. I must add that this was not so before Islam. The Arabs before Islam used intercalation. I mean, they added a month, very much like the Jews do, and therefore had a solar lunar calendar year, like the Jewish year. But the Quran forbids intercalation and severs the ties intentionally between the veneration of God and devotions that are devoted to God alone and all other things like the seasons and the agriculture forces.
Fascinating.
This is perhaps a good point to segue into my next question, which relates to the very interesting case that you made earlier about how these practices were inspired and influenced by practices in pre-Islamic and early Islamic periods. And I would like now to ask you to answer briefly, because we will need to wrap up soon, about the interrelation between this medieval period you've been studying, somewhere between the 10th and 15th, 16th centuries, right, to modern Islam, to more modern periods, and how the genesis and development of these perceptions and notions about these issues that you tackle in the book manifest themselves in later periods.
Well, I'd say that the debates continue, and many of the practices also continue into throughout the Ottoman period, if we look from the perspective of the Middle East, and into the modern period. And they continue to be debated, both the veneration of saints, of saintly figures, and of places sanctified by the presence of the prophets or the relics, or by incidents that took place in those spots. And as I've already said, the debate became violent in both in the late 17th and the 18th century with the rise of Wahhabi Islam in the Arab Peninsula. A movement that was very much against those practices, so much so that they even ruined the Prophet's tomb, so that even the visitation of the Prophet would come to a halt. It was rebuilt, of course, right? But still, the Wahhabi Islam echoes. I mean, it's still the dominant Islam of Arabia, of Saudi Arabia. And the ideas of the Wahhabis and their opposition to those practices is quite influential today, as I've said, in all Islamic movements. We can still see on the internet discussions regarding the special status of Rajab. I read a compilation made by an Egyptian Azhari scholar, one from the most important religious institution of Egypt. I think it was published in 1962, and then and it's all about the debate about whether Rajab is supposed to be venerated and whether a specific prayer that was born in Jerusalem, in 11th century Jerusalem. Actually, that began my interest in the whole story. This little episode telling about a person coming from Nablus, from Shechem, to Jerusalem, to Al-Aqsa, to pray in Al-Aqsa on one day of the first Thursday of Rajab, and claiming that he is performing a prayer that the Prophet himself recommended, based on a hadith, based on a saying of the Prophet. and as happens in Jerusalem, people see someone performing a special devotion, so the curious come and may join in. So a few people joined in. And then, tells us the historian, the next year more people joined in, and by the third year everyone thought it was, something that goes back to the days of the Prophet, and began to practice it all over the place. And in my first book, which dealt with the religious life in medieval Syria, including Palestine, of course, I traced the spread of this specific prayer on the night of the first Thursday of Rajab to Egypt and Iraq and northern Syria, and it was all over the place, with many scholars trying to stop this trend, and claim that there is absolutely no evidence that this was a custom recommended by the Prophet or ever practiced by a Prophet. We still find those debates on the internet today, whether this in the scholar that wrote about it in compiled this collection in 1962 claimed that today only some old ladies and Sufi mystics still perform the prayer, but apparently, since it's still debated, there are more than just a handful of old ladies who still perform this prayer and who still believe that Rajab has a privileged place in the eyes of God, and that anyone who prays and fasts and gives alms and performs visitation to sacred places during this particular month will be rewarded doubly and 10 times than he would have been rewarded any other time. And we find more in the medieval sources, I think, than in contemporary sources, that it's also the other way around, that one should be especially careful not to commit sins and not to violate the sanctity of the time, because he also will be doubly punished on the place. So this, I'm using this just to say that the sacred has also a dangerous side to it. As anyone who read the portion of the week, Parashat Shmini, and the sudden startling death of Nadav and Avihu and Uzzah must remember, right? That the sacred has something dangerous, but also something very promising. And this is actually what Muslims have had stressed throughout the ages, that the sacred place and the sacred time hold a promise of special proximity to God and special rewards.
That's really, really fascinating. And I would like to thank you, Professor Daniella Talmon-Heller, for joining us today in this discussion about your latest book, Sacred Place and Sacred Time in the Medieval Islamic Middle East, a historical perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And
if I may add, Ramadan Kareem.
Oh yes, it's just started, indeed, to all our Muslim listeners, wherever you are. And also thanks to Ariel Cohen, our producer, and to Itai Shalem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 600 interviews. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And follow me and Dalia and the Tel Aviv Review Podcast on Twitter. We have a new account for the podcast, so please follow. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.